The Old Testament is full of ugly things, atrocities, harsh punishments in Leviticus and Numbers for disobeying protocols, etc. Can you comment on this?
Sure.
I'll bet you can.
So it's true. So we look at some of the punishments, right, in books like Leviticus especially, and we go, well, that seems a little bit harsh. There's a line you may have learned if you grew up in the church. The wages of sin is, anybody remember? Death. And so every sin deserves what? Death. And so you take like Leviticus 20 verse 10, where Moses writes about how if someone strays from their wedding vows, they ought to be put to death. Now, here's the amazing thing about this. I've taught on this before in a Bible class. Those punishments that are a lot of times kind of panned and put down, those punishments, Old Testament written in Hebrew, and they're in the simple future tense, which basically means this. If someone sins or if someone does something wrong, they will be put to death. And you can interpret that two ways. You can interpret that as a command, or you can interpret that as what would be called a permissive. So it's like, you shall be put to death. That's it. Or you can be put to death because the wages of sin is what? Death. And that is the reality of the punishment that we all face. Now, one of the great things about reading a book like Leviticus is you always got to ask, who can interpret this the best? Now, my bias is Jesus can. And so there's this one real famous story in John chapter 8. Some of you may have heard it before, about a woman who's caught breaking her marriage vows. She's caught in adultery. And the religious leaders drag her out to be stoned, right? Leviticus 20, verse 10, shall be put to death. And Jesus kind of questions their interpretation a little bit. He takes what they take as a command and makes it a permissive. This can happen, but it doesn't have to. You see, Jesus has a choice here between judgment and mercy. And he chooses mercy. Now, that's not undermining the authority of the Old Testament. It is very clear in what it says the wages of sin are. But Jesus is also very clear that the wages of sin do not need to be our wages when we're with him.
God desires mercy and not sacrifice.